News channel. I'm Desiree Chauke and Melinda Bota is giving us sign language. Coming up on the program this morning, we're watching that cluster ministerial media briefing in Pretoria from the Department of International Relations, where cabinet members will outline some of the initial detail of the nationwide lockdown announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa last night. Chriselda Lewis is there and we'll be crossing to her momentarily. We're also going live to our colleagues all over the country to look at different provincial and local reactions to the drastic actions being recommended by the president to stop the spread of COVID-19. Let's start the show. An inter-ministerial committee will this morning provide more details of government's interventions following the announcement of a 21-day lockdown. For more on today's ministerial address, we cross live to our colleague Chriselda Lewis. She's standing by in Pretoria. Chriselda, help us set the scene for today. What's to be expected in this meeting?
Well, that's right, Desiree. An unprecedented decision made by President Cyril Ramaphosa last night in addressing the nation. Of course, that lockdown will start at midnight on a Thursday. And you'd recall, Desiree, that South Africa is only the second country on the continent now, following Rwanda, to institute this lockdown. Rwanda, of course, doing that with numbers far less than South Africa. Our numbers currently of the infection rate at 402. So yesterday, while President Cyril Ramaphosa was putting final touches to that address of his to the nation, of course, the concern for South Africa would have been to what extent the country would go to ensure that it stops the further spread of the coronavirus in the country. So you'd recall also, Desiree, that number of 402, of course, spiraling sixfold over the past 8 days, bringing that number to 402. So South Africa certainly needed to be seen to be taking decisive action with regard to stopping the further spread of the coronavirus in the country. So here today, we're expecting at 10 o'clock members of the economic cluster to brief the media to basically give a much more detailed report on exactly how all of this is going to unfold. You'd recall that President Ramaphosa in his address last night had indicated that about 250,000 people around the world are infected with the coronavirus. So with that, you would expect a deep recession to follow, as well as businesses that will close and massive job losses which will be on the cards. How is South Africa planning to deal with that? We're expecting this economic cluster to delve much more into how South Africa plans to cushion, in particular, small businesses that are expected to suffer in the long run. There's great concern at the moment about, of course, on this lockdown for 21 days, what then this would mean for business. Lots of calls for business as well to also come to the party to assist government. You'd recall that the president had also announced last night a solidarity fund. So that solidarity fund calls for people to contribute towards that, and that would mean then that would contribute towards assisting some of the most vulnerable in society. So we're expecting a lot of detail about perhaps how all of that is going to unfold, Desiree.
That detail relates mostly to business and the dispensation of funds, Chriselda, but on most people's minds this morning is just detail about how to conduct their lives in the next 21 days. Do you envisage we will be getting that detail?
Well, certainly, Desiree, since this morning, there's been great concern from the general public about what this means from a Thursday at midnight going forward for the next 21 days. Following that, the restrictions of movements. You heard, of course, the president indicate that, the pharmacies will be opened. Healthcare workers will be amongst those who would be exempt from these restrictions. And, for many South Africans at this point is how they're going to go out and buy groceries. Of course, you would know that you will be allowed to go and do that. But of course, you would have to give valid reasons, of course, if you're to come across perhaps the South African Police Service together with the South African National Defence Force, who are assisting SABC in ensuring that these tight restrictions that have been put in place by South Africa are certainly adhered to. Because ultimately, Desiree, at the end of the day, I've been saying since this morning, while government had a responsibility to ensure that it does take decisive action, despite the fact that South Africa has not recorded recorded any deaths thus far. You would know that just around the corner in Zimbabwe, one death has already been recorded, Nigeria as well. So South Africa needed to be seen to be acting even way before it reaches that kind of level. So South Africans at this point wanting more details exactly about what will this mean for them in terms of movements. We've been listening to quite a number of radio stations as well, including those on the SABC platform, where you got a number of them calling in, asking what happens then, how they'll be able to go out and simply buy those essentials. But of course, you heard from the president that pharmacies, for example, would be open. Those in need of urgent medical care would be able to access that. So we're expecting a lot of details. This is not just the economic cluster, which will be briefing us here at 10 o'clock. There's another briefing on the social cluster that is expected at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And I know that the justice and crime prevention cluster will be briefing the media tomorrow as well. So we're expecting a lot more detail in terms of exactly what South Africans should do, in particular during this time.
That social cluster meeting will be very important in relation to the assistance that the president promised to homeless people in terms of how they're going to be able to implement that.
Well, absolutely, Desiree. You heard the president say that specific areas have been or will be allocated, for example, for homeless people. And this is also to ensure that you do not have maximum or even minimum movement on the streets around the country. So with that, the president was quite clear that provision, for example, will be made for homeless people and other vulnerable sectors of society to ensure that while they may need some kind of assistance, it is done within the strict restrictions in terms of what the law has set aside. So that's some of the clarity that we're also expecting from the social cluster at 2 o'clock this afternoon.
Chriselda, give us the detail again in terms of the times of these gatherings.
Right, Desiree, at 10 o'clock this morning, that's the economic cluster, of course, which will speak to the massive impact that we're expecting this lockdown to have on South Africa's economy, and what cushioning, of course, there will be for, amongst others, small businesses. And then at 2 o'clock this afternoon, the social cluster will give a briefing on exactly, some of the vulnerable members of society, how they will be taken care of during this period. And then tomorrow, the security, justice and crime cluster will also be giving a briefing on exactly, for example, how many soldiers will be deployed to the streets to give some assistance, of course, to the South African Police Service to ensure that everything is implemented as government had announced.
Thank you so much for setting the scene for us. Chriselda Lewis is at the DERCO building in Pretoria.